Helena, what do you say broadly to what you've heard and the question? We had no alternative, Rachel Reeves says.
I think Annabelle and Stuart, with respect, are living in an alternate reality. My constituents in Hastings and Rye are fully aware of the consequences of what the Conservatives did over the last 14 years. Liz Truss crashing the economy, sending mortgages and interest rates spiralling, and they're still paying the consequences of that. And what we inherited as a government, when Rachel Reeves came into the Treasury, she was presented with the figures from the civil servants, a 22 billion black hole. There are numerous examples of that. You can look at the exact breakdown on the government website if you wish to, Stuart.
What's stupid about this, right, is that I don't think she's necessarily wrong. I've critiqued the framing of the £22 billion black hole, but I don't really care. I don't actually really care. Like, the public services were in a mess, they needed more funding, taxes went up, whatever. I'm not really that fussed. But when she talks about my constituents in Hastings, I think actually, Helena, most of the people in your constituency, as with the rest of the country, apart from people who voted for reform, their main concerns were the cost of living crisis and the state of the NHS. Rather than having this discussion over whether or not there's any veracity of this black hole statement, which again, I think Stuart Jackson is pretty much correct in saying, well, no one really believes you. And I think that's true, but people do believe that the government were elected to fix the NHS and to fix public services and to fix the cost of living crisis. If you just went, well, my constituents in Hastings are looking at the state of the country after 14 years of Conservative government, looking at a public realm that's been absolutely decimated, and going, well, yeah, maybe it's fair enough that we might need to pay a little bit more to fix these public services. And the polls show it, because Labour are still polling ahead of the Tories and ahead of Reform. But banging on about the £22 billion black hole when it's not even supported by the public, and talking about the state of the nation's finances, no, actually talk about what your voters want to hear, which is, we will fix the NHS, which of course they won't do because they've put a fucking plum, they've put a stooge in a sue in the form of Wes Streeting as Health Secretary, who hasn't got a fucking clue what he's talking about. All it then does is actually give credence to the arguments in response, saying, well, if it's only ever about economic competence rather than the state of public services, then it doesn't matter really about what the actual plans are of the government to fix these things. Any political position that the government gets support from on a vibes basis can be undermined by other vibes. That's really important. Anything that the government have tried to foment in the public consciousness through vibes alone, like the Tories are bad with the economy because blah, 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 back hole, rather than you can't trust the Tories with public services, because that's just, the other one's just vibes based, whereas people have a real material reality that's shaped by the failure on public services, right? When only you campaign on the vibes being off, somebody else can campaign against you on vibes based arguments in the other direction against you. It is, again, a majority and a supporter base built entirely on sand, rhetorical sand. And Helena Dollemore might be pretty strong on rhetoric, but if people's material conditions don't actually improve, people will be able to vibes themselves out of voting Labour.
To just take one example, asylum costs. £300 million was budgeted, over £8 billion spent. Commitment after commitment was press released and announced and not put into any department budgets. So what this government have done is be honest with the British public. In the budget, we have been very honest about the choices we have to take. We had a difficult set of circumstances that we've inherited from the last government, but we are determined to put this country back on the right setting by fixing the foundations, closing the £22 billion black hole.
Oh my god, it's just over and over and over again, just ticking off squares on the bingo card. Oh my god. And people were praising her on like social media, saying this is a new rising star to watch of the Labour Party, and all she's doing is going 22 billion black hole, fix the foundations, difficult decisions, fiscal responsibility. Oh god, it's soporific. Literally soporific.
And yes, that has involved tough decisions like raising the NI rate. But we've been really careful as part of that to ensure that working people don't pay more in their pay slips, that small businesses in my constituency are protected in those changes, and big businesses, like all businesses in our society, need public services to be rebuilt, which is what we're doing in this budget.
You didn't have to give a £9 billion bung to your trade union paymasters.
Oh my god. Oh my god. I'm so sick of hearing public sector paymasters, trade union paymasters. I'm sorry. You spent, as the Conservative government, more money fighting the industrial action under the trade unions than it cost the new government to solve those disputes. You spent more money making life worse for doctors and nurses, the most trusted professions in the country, definitely more trusted than politicians and journalists, or indeed members of the House of Lords, Mr. Jackson. So don't come to me talk about trade union paymasters when it was actually, unironically, a fiscally conservative decision by the Labour government to settle the disputes that were destroying the NHS. Especially not when we need these people paid well because of Baumol's cost disease, otherwise they'll be lost to the private sector and we'll have even fewer doctors and nurses in our NHS. The NHS, which, as I said before, is the very specific thing that a Labour Party were elected to fix because it was the biggest concern for voters outside of dealing with the cost of living crisis, which is part and parcel of that anyway. They spent that money with a clear objective in mind, though, Helena. They'd hoped to drive the doctors and nurses out so they could say the NHS was dead. That's very true. There was an ideological project for fighting the trade unions by the Conservative government, because the more doctors and nurses that we lose to the private sector, the more they can justify privatising the NHS.
With no meaningful comprehensive reform, for instance, in the NHS.
Well, we have been really clear, Stuart, that we are reforming the NHS. More cash in the budget for the NHS
but you
goes
also
hand
said
in
no
hand
more
with reform.
money for the NHS before reform, and in fact, they've got an awful lot more money.
With no
Actually, the Health Secretary has been setting out the agenda of reform that we are undertaking. But
you know what reform the NHS needs? Get the fucking private sector out of it. Get the PFIs gone. Obviously, West Streeting won't do that and is doing the opposite. But, you know, what was happened the last time we tried to reform the healthcare service? We got the Lansley reforms that were so shit that even the Conservative Party admit that they were terrible and basically undid all of them. How about we use the method that actually works, that we know that works, which has only ever been undermined because the Conservative government cut NHS funding as a percentage of GDP every single year from 2010 to 2019. And wouldn't you know it? Oh, well, the waiting list was rising throughout that entire period. What a surprise that as you cut funding as a percentage of GDP, the waiting lists might go up, having been decreasing throughout the 13 years prior. Wow, I'm so shocked that when you took money out of the healthcare service, the waiting lists went up. The slack in the system was reduced. It was trying to be maximum on efficiency rather than on redundancy. And then we had a pandemic which massively exposed the fact that there was no slack in the system. Well done. The Conservative government destroyed the NHS, and now they're trying to say that it's unfixable, that it needs fundamental reform.
what many people have experienced in the past couple of years is NHS strikes, which cost the NHS over £1.5 billion, led to huge numbers of cancelled appointments, record waiting lists in the NHS. The Conservatives wouldn't even meet the junior doctors. We got those strikes ended. We made a settlement with the junior doctors, and we're trying in recent years.
So we owe it to people was for the productive side of the economy to be squeezed and squeezed and squeezed in order that ever-increasing funds could be poured towards the public sector. Yes, of course, they want an improvement in services, but that can be delivered through reform. It's not going to be delivered if the expectation among those working in the public sector is simply that they'll get more money regardless of whether their output increases.
Well,
okay, so I've mentioned it a couple of times this stream, but I have to make sure that everyone knows what Baumol's cost disease is. Let me find it. The Baumol effect, also known as Baumol's cost disease, is the tendency for wages in jobs that have experienced little or no increase in labour productivity to rise in response to rising wages in other jobs that did experience high productivity growth. In turn, these sectors of the economy become more expensive over time because their input costs increase while productivity does not. Typically, this affects services more than manufactured goods, and in particular health, education, arts and culture. And the reason why this specifically affects health and education is because it's really difficult to get productivity increases in these sectors. Unless you drastically change the technological ways of working in these specific sectors, which is mostly about human-to-human interaction in healthcare and education, like you can't just randomly get teachers to work more hours than everybody else just because they do a service that's face-to-face and they can't teach 50 children in the same time it used to take to teach 30, because that is the amount of one-on-one interaction you can't just squeeze into a shorter period of time. Like, there's no productivity to be gained in education without technological investment or technological advancement that change the face of the sector in different ways. They have to have increases in price, otherwise you lose these workers to the private sector. And you can't just have a non-educated workforce. You can't just have an unhealthy workforce because teachers and nurses have decided to become retail workers. You can't just have a non-healthy economy, because that will also conversely affect productivity in the rest of the economy. If you don't have a highly educated workforce, if you don't have a healthy workforce, they cannot be productive elsewhere. The reason why that you succumb to Baumol's cost disease in healthcare and education is because these are critical. These are critical for the functioning of the rest of the private sector and the rest of the private economy. Any right-winger that bangs on about increases in wages for the public sector without requisite productivity increases fundamentally do not understand economics. They do not understand labour economics. They don't understand macroeconomics. They don't understand statecraft as a basic instrument. They don't understand it at all. Maybe because right-wingers don't understand economics. They just don't. They never have done. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.